Well, this is something we've seen a lot of people talk about recently, about how the console wars, for a lot of different reasons, it would seem are ending. I have felt that way for a lot of different reasons, but this is actually now coming from a former PlayStation executive named Shawn Layden. He made an appearance just recently at Gamescom Asia, and now that he has left PlayStation, he doesn't have to be necessarily biased anymore when he answers these questions. He was kind of asked about the state of consoles, where are we at now? What is the future looking like? Maybe even in reference specifically to the console wars. I don't know if that was exactly the question that was asked, but his answer very much had to do with the console wars, and basically that he felt that the console wars, this war, this ongoing feud or race to be the best, mainly between Xbox and PlayStation, but also sometimes Nintendo, is now reaching an endpoint that we are now going to see very soon. Now, what he referenced for his reason is actually having to do with specs. Yeah, he focused a lot of his comments basically saying how the console wars have mainly been focused on specs, who has the better specs. Xbox has a higher frame rate. Well, no, PlayStation, they have more storage and now they have a better frame rate. Xbox now has faster processing. Well, no, PlayStation now does. You get the picture. Basically, he was referencing how these console wars are mainly just a back and forth on who has these better specs, but he has basically said that now, where we can get specs to be on consoles while also remaining financially sustainable, and while making these specs actually affect things that matter, that consumers can actually see the difference in, that whole thing, according to Shawn Layden, has plateaued. He says that, like the resolution in, say, 8K TVs, people aren't really going to be able to see past that with the naked eye. Other things too, like super high frame rates, as it gets so high, it just almost doesn't even matter. Yeah, there's definitely a human limitation when it comes to things we can actually observe. But going beyond that, if consoles want to continue to make these advancements in specs, he says that this is no longer going to be financially viable. For a very long time now, Xbox and Sony mainly have bled their costs in making these machines run hardware that are very expensive. And many times, I think for the longest time now, they've been selling these consoles at a loss. Now, according to Shawn Layden, it's gotten to a point where if you're going to make any more big leaps in your specs for consoles, it's going to cost so much money for the suppliers of these consoles that it's just not going to make sense. You're going to have to either sell these consoles at a huge loss, or you're going to have to ask your customers, your fans of Xbox or PlayStation, to fork over like $1,200 or something crazy like that. But he said that these console wars ending on a specs perspective is actually a very good thing, because now these big game companies are going to have to focus a lot more on just the actual content in their game, not who has the most impressive numbers, specs behind them. To me, I see that as nothing but a great thing. I mean, obviously on one hand, it's great to see consoles that have better output with specs, but on the other hand, yeah, at least for consoles, maybe not so much PCs where you can do a lot more customization, but for consoles, it just isn't going to make any more sense to be pumping them out with more and more expensive specs, a lot of which you're maybe not going to notice the difference between, and hopefully it will free up more time for, Xbox and Sony to care more on, are these games fun, rather than maybe how impressive do these games look. Now, I also think the console wars are ending for a lot of other different reasons. You definitely see less console exclusives these days. That was a big thing that was behind the console wars, mainly in like the early 2000s. You also see the availability and advancement of PC. I know it's a bit odd throwing this in because, technically the PC is kind of a part of the console wars, and I am kind of talking about specs here when I say that, yeah, PC can definitely pump out way better specs, and especially the availability of games on PC is just, it's no question. You have a lot more games that you can play on the PC versus a console. But yeah, overall, I do agree with what Shawn Layden is saying. I think specs, for consoles anyway, have really gotten to a point where they're either just going to go unnoticed by their consumer, or it's going to be so expensive that suppliers aren't going to want to fork over the cost for it, or consumers are not going to want to fork over the extra cost for it. Hey, to me, any takeaway that emphasizes the need for better content in the games rather than better specs, that is definitely something that I can agree with. I definitely hope big companies like Xbox, PlayStation, and Nintendo are noticing this and understanding this going forward.